To sum up, here's the list of what we've learned so far that makes internet porn a unique threat to our brains. Number 1. Internet porn affords extreme novelty. So you can just keep clicking, looking at 300 women in a session, squirting an extraordinary amount of dopamine into your brain. This is what separates internet porn from ancient porn. Here's number 2. Unlike eating or using addictive drugs, there's absolutely no limit to the consumption of internet porn. Unless you fall asleep, I guess. This is a really big factor because when you look at drugs or food, your brain says stop at a certain point. With internet porn, you can keep your dopamine level elevated for hours on end by watching or edging. That's what really makes it very addictive. Even if you climaxed, for example, you can often override your normal satiation mechanisms by finding some other porn star that's even more stimulating to get you going and give you another boost of dopamine. This brings us to number 3. You know, with food and addictive drugs, you can only escalate by consuming more over time. But with internet porn, escalation can switch from more actors to shocking new genres of porn, new flavors of sexual practices that have no limits. Number 4 is even more special. Unlike food or addictive drugs that need efforts to obtain, internet porn is always there in your brain, waiting for you to replay it. I imagine a lot of you have experienced this. Now, it can come in the form of flashbacks that are wanted or unwanted, but they do come back, and when they come back, they cause a rise in dopamine, a little squirt, which further strengthens your addiction pathways.
Here's another reason internet porn is so stimulating and so addictive. It takes advantage of an old program located in your primitive brain. The subconscious program is what got you started down the path of using porn. Consider this experiment. What happens when you drop a male rat into a cage with a receptive female? Well, first, you see a frenzy of copulation. Progressively, the male tires of female number 1. She wants more, but he's had enough. He just can't get excited anymore. So, what do? Well, replace the original female with a fresh one. And the male revives and gallantly struggles to fertilize her. He keeps on going. Then, the same things happen. The male loses interest in female number 2. Starting to see a pattern here. See, this is a genetic program. This has nothing to do with your genitals. It's all happening in the brain. If you think about heavy porn users, they often need more novelty, just like these animals, to get excited. Here's what's going on with the animals. It's called the Coolidge effect. It starts out with declining interest in the present sexual partner, then renewed vigor in a novel sexual partner. This is present in all mammals. Here's the limbic system. The primitive brain where the old program is installed is often called the limbic system, or mammal brain. It's the part of the brain we have in common with all mammals. It's true we have only a single brain, but certain parts have specific jobs. This part is ancient, 100 million years old or older, and its job is all about survival. In this graphic, you can see a limbic system in dark colour, and the cerebral cortex on the outside, which is very large in humans and much smaller in monkeys and rats and other animals. You can think of cerebral cortex as the rational, logical brain, sort of like Spock on Star Trek. It's not emotional, it's the planning, thinking part of our brain, which comes up with clever ideas. Now, the cerebral cortex understands the consequences of our actions. The limbic system does not. Now, you're looking at the center of the brain, sliced down in the middle, and you can see there is this pretty small area called reward circuit. It actually goes from the limbic system up to the rational brain. This is so important. You see, this is where you experience all desire and most pleasure, such as sex and orgasm. It drives you to eat, engage in sex, take risks and bond. It's where you fall in love with your spouse and with your children and your parents. It also gets activated when your team wins, or you feel like an alpha male, or you're bungee jumping. The more exciting the experience, the stronger this reward circuitry is activated. But keep in mind that it's also activated for simple pleasures like watching a beautiful sunset, a walk in the woods, or even a smile from a girlfriend. Chemicals turn on and off certain parts of the brain. For the reward circuitry, it's dopamine. It's the main chemical of a group called a neurotransmitters that turns the reward circuitry on.
The reward circuitry is the engine. It truly is. And dopamine is the gas. Dopamine has lots of nicknames. The craving neurochemical. The I've got to have it no matter what neurochemical. You see, it's behind all motivation to do anything. If you really like high-calorie foods, that may be because you actually get a bigger blast of dopamine for it than you do for low-calorie foods. You crave them more because they register as more rewarding. That's why you choose chocolate cake over Brussels sprouts. It has been programmed. You're not craving ice cream or sex with a porn star. No, you're actually craving more stimulation of your reward circuitry. The bigger the surge of dopamine in response to something, the more you want it. Now, excluding drugs like meth or cocaine, orgasm is the biggest blast of dopamine. Here's the normal pattern of dopamine release. It looks something like a roller coaster because, in biology, what goes up must come down. It could be food, sex, or even water when you're thirsty. So, let's say you're hungry. Dopamine starts rising. Then you think about a burger, and it rises more. When the burger is sizzling, dopamine's going way up. It peaks right about your first bite, then you take some more bites and it starts to drop off, and finally drops back down to normal levels, and you're full. The rise of dopamine levels could also represent anything new or novel, because dopamine loves novelty. A new car, a just-released movie, the latest gadget. Now, back to the Coolidge effect. So, dopamine is what is behind the Coolidge effect. If you look at our little graph here, we have a female rat number 1, female rat number 2, and dopamine level. What's happening is that the reward circuitry of the male is squirting less and less dopamine in each copulation with female number 1. And then eventually, the male can no longer copulate because there's not enough dopamine. Dopamine is behind libido. Then you drop in female number 2, and the male gets another squirt of dopamine that surges his libido, and he goes back to work. This is what's behind the Coolidge effect, and it's also why you click onto new videos while you're watching porn, to get another big squirt of dopamine with something novel. Okay, let's give another nickname to dopamine. Let's call it the molecule of addiction. Cocaine, alcohol, nicotine. All addictive chemicals and activities raise dopamine levels. Here's an odd thing. Dopamine is released in response to expectations rather than actual levels of pleasure. It's the drive to get it. It's the craving. The actual pleasure of eating or orgasm is probably opioids. Those are morphine-like chemicals being released in the brain. Dopamine is wanting it. Opiates are liking it. Addictions are basically chasing after dopamine. So what happens is addiction is wanting more but liking it less. The reward circuitry. Here's an experiment. We have a rat and you see there's a wire and then there's this electrode that's actually going to the reward circuitry of the rat. And the rat has its little paw on a lever, and whenever it hits that lever, it sends just enough electricity to the reward circuitry to stimulate it. Now, what will happen is this rat will just keep hitting the lever and hitting the lever thousands of times an hour until it drops. It won't stop to eat, sleep, have sex, or even take care of the pups. It'll give up everything just to press that lever. As we know, this behavior is not unlike some serious drug addicts. Here's another experiment. They take the same rat and they have an electric grid between the lever and the rat. So the rat has to feel painful shock in its little paws to go over to the lever and press it. Well, the rat will actually cross the bridge and endure the shock. But if you take the rat and put an electric grid between them and food, they will not cross the electric grid. They will not undergo shocks to eat food. They would rather starve. Here's more experiment to show the power of dopamine in your reward circuitry. If you take rats and block their dopamine, they have absolutely no motivation. They'll not even eat. They won't walk over to the food dish and they'll starve to death. But they still like food. If you drop food into their mouths, they eat it and show little rat smiles. They just have no motivation to go get it. They lie around. They won't have sex either. The male rats show no signs of libido. The key point is, you need the right level of dopamine to function normally. It does lots of important jobs. Dopamine gives you that positive outlook, good attitude, keeps you motivated, keeps you happy. Incidentally, many psychological problems involve dopamine imbalances, including addictions. To understand addiction, we need to understand what changes, and that is nerve cells. The brain contains billions of nerve cells, and they're connected in circuits or pathways like the reward circuit, and endless other circuits. When a circuit is activated, we have a thought, a feeling, an experience specific to those circuits. We have a picture of two nerve cells, and they're connected at a tiny little gap called a synapse. See, you have electricity that flows along one nerve cell to the other nerve cell, but it really doesn't. The electricity stops at this little gap, and it causes the sending nerve cell to release neurochemicals, maybe dopamine, and then they float over and they attach to the receiving nerve cell. They attach to places called receptors. If there are enough neurochemicals released from the sending cell, the receiving cell hears the message and fires an impulse. And then we have an experience. This gap between two nerve cells. Well, this is where all addictions occur. The more electricity comes, the more dopamine is released. So if you look at the left one, you have a whole lot of dopamine because you have more impulses of electricity heading down the reward cell. This would give you a greater experience of excitement. It may be like heading towards orgasm. You're high. You don't want to stop. Let's look at the right cell. You can see there's hardly any dopamine being released. This could be after an orgasm, where you have no desire whatsoever. If you look at this picture, the cell's normal number of receptors is full of dopamine. Here it's simplified to just 4, so a go signal is being transmitted to the receiving cell. With addiction, changes occur with the number of receptors. The D2 receptor is the type of dopamine receptor that actually crashes. That may not be interesting, but I need to mention that. Now with overstimulation, the dopamine will overflow into the synapse. The receiving nerve cell says, "Enough, I can't handle all this dopamine." It's like someone screams at you and you cover your ears. Well, nerve cells accomplish this by getting rid of their dopamine receptors. In other words, you may have plenty of gas to run the reward circuitry. That is the dopamine, but your engine is missing some of the cylinders, the receptors. Fewer dopamine receptors lead to a weakened sensitivity or numbed pleasure response. The cycle of declining dopamine receptors is also part of the cycle of addiction. It starts up with binging on, let's say, porn. And that causes a decline in dopamine receptors, which numbs out the pleasure response of the brain, which means you need something more to stimulate it, and that is what shows up as cravings. So, in order to satisfy it, you do more binging. Maybe it's more porn. Perhaps it's more alcohol, or more whatever, which then causes an even further decline in dopamine receptors. You get stuck in sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. It's an endless mating opportunities, which of course is porn. Then it leads to the Coolidge effect, which is binging, then leads to fewer dopamine receptors, and if you continue, it leads to cravings for more novel opportunities, or the binge mechanism. And there you have it. This is one of the main reasons addicts have such cravings. They're looking for something to make them feel good. This is an addiction test. If you say yes to 3 or more of these questions, then you have an addiction. At least, according to the American Psychiatric Association. Let's go over each one. Tolerance. That's a strange word, but it means, has your use increased or escalated over time? In other words, do you watch it for more hours? Or have you escalated to more shocking or more extreme porn? Withdrawal. It's not necessary to have withdrawal symptoms if you have an addiction. But most users on our forum do experience some symptoms when they quit. It varies a lot. Could be anxiety, irritability, fatigue, depression. Those are the most common. But some also experience physical symptoms like cold and flu symptoms, headaches, the inability to sleep, and others. Number 3, difficulty controlling your use. So, do you use for a longer time than you'd like to? I think that's pretty clear, self-explanatory. Number 4, do you understand the negative consequences it does to your mood, to your health? Porn use has been associated with anxiety disorder and sexual dysfunction. Number 5, neglecting or postponing activities. It means, are you doing porn instead of life? Number 6, the desire to cut down. Now, most addicts say they can quit any time, but they don't. If you've had unsuccessful attempts to cut down, that would be a yes to that question. And last one, number 7. Spending significant time or emotional energy obtaining, using, concealing, planning, or recovering from use. Have you ever concealed your porn use? I think everyone can say yes to that. So, what do you do now if you have a porn addiction? Well, that's a really big question. It involves your brain's neuroplasticity ability to weaken your addiction pathways, and of course, strengthen your rational logical pathways. So the best way to reboot and rewire is actually to give your brain a rest from intense sexual stimulation such as porn, masturbation, orgasm, and sexual fantasy, and wait until it returns to normal responsiveness. The process will be difficult. You may experience some withdrawal symptoms and frequent relapses, but keep on going and beat your previous records again and again, day by day, and things will get easier. Some pro tips for you to be more prepared for the journey. 1. Gather as much knowledge about porn addiction as possible. 2. Change your environment. Limit your internet browsing in private. Invite everyone in, or bring your activity to a more public setting. 3. Replace your porn habits with something else you enjoy. For instance, walking in the park or reading a book in a well-lit room with your phone turned off and sealed in a box. 4. Be ready for withdrawal symptoms. Calm down and try to understand and endure the feeling of anxiety, irritability, fatigue, or drowsiness that will come after. 5. Travel together. Stay in touch and active with your journey mates through the rebooting process. Support each other by giving positive encouragement. All these tips will get you to a good start, but you still have to be careful of triggers along the way. Avoid these triggers however you can by 1. Sleeping early. 2. Limiting your visit to certain places. Places like clubs, music concerts, or popular streets, where unexpected people of all kinds meet may tempt you sexually. 3. Limiting your internet mindless browsing. This can lower the chance of you stumbling into graphics or ideas that fuel your desire to do porn. 4. Not hanging around very often with people who are still ferociously consuming porn, who remind you of porn or inviting you to it. 5. Keeping yourself busy and productive. Boredom and certain emotions may become a trigger if indulged. There are also some people who do specific weird actions, like snorting water whenever they're about to relapse. Maybe it works because it's weird. You try whatever works for you. Our animated unconditional support is always here for a reminder.
Thank you for your continuous support, especially our valued patrons and members who have been encouraging us to keep producing more quality content.